Hello, welcome back to A Drunk History of Middle-earth. It's me, Chris. How are we doing? Hello, hello, hello. Right, I'm alone again. Here I am, on my own. Balls deep in this Sauron episode. Really annoyingly, Rebecca is reading Fellowship of the Ring for the first time. She's reading Lord of the Rings for the first time. Last night, we were laid in bed. I was just playing Path of Exile 2. I was just having a good time. She started listening to the book. She went, I have some questions. When did Sauron make the rings? Who made them? Was there other ones involved? And every one of these questions, it went on and on for a couple of minutes. I said, yeah, I answered that in the last podcast episode. Yep, answered that in the last podcast episode. Yep. Eventually, she was like, shall I just listen to it? I was like, yes, absolutely. You should just fucking listen to it. So I am not exempt from this. I have the podcast. Rebecca is a co-host to this podcast, and I still use the podcast for her. So, but she's off to New York tomorrow. Well, her and her mum are off to London tomorrow, then they're off to New York, where that is their present from me for the next good few years, I should imagine. And then in February, she's going to Egypt with her dad. It was 2 bucket list holidays for her parents, and I was like, do you know what, fuck it. You can go, send her away. She deserves it. Becca's a fantastic mother, fantastic wife, and will never book anything for herself because she always thinks of reasons not to. And her parents are exactly the same. So I was like, fuck it, get out of the country. However, now that time is here, I'm shitting myself because I don't know how single parents do it, because my daughter is annoying as fuck. I love her to death. But she is 3 years old, she is sassy, she has attitude, she's confident, and worse than that, she can hold a full conversation, which she does whether you're involved or not. So for the next, and Bomber is a Labrador who has not quite reached the age of 2 yet, so is still a bit of a twat. So please pray for me. I'm doing this on a Saturday night. I might release it straight after. I probably will. You know where I'm like, I can't hold my water. Once I've recorded, I just want to get it out there because I'm like, I'm done. Another 2 weeks, I'm done. So yes, pray for me for the next few days. See how it goes. Right. Probably won't come out in time for this, but we're doing a chill little read along in the Discord server. Now Flash. It's not a proper book club. It's just a few people wanted to read The Hobbit, so I said, right, fuck it. Some of you can't do it without structure, and I'll make the structure. So yeah, if you join the Discord, come and say hello. Don't just pop in. Don't say anything like a fucking weirdo. Unless you just like to see me casually abuse my friends, in which case, yeah, go for it. Anyway, right, we've got a lot to cover today. You might notice that the title of this one's going to be a little bit odd, because we are now into part 6 of the Sauron series, and I can't just keep calling it Sauron part 6, especially when this episode is entirely about the war between the Elves and Sauron. So it will be just called The War Between the Elves and Sauron, or The War of the Elves and Sauron, whatever. And then Sauron Part 6 will come after it. So luckily, these aren't print books or DVD covers that you'll notice has messed up your shelf. So I think we're okay. But yes, we've got a lot to cover today, because as usual, I thought, half of the episode about the war, maybe the next half I might get to Numenor. Wrong. As usual, I am wrong. So, we ended the last episode with Sauron declaring war on the Elves and demanding that they give him the magic rings that they all made. We covered that there were 9 rings which would go to the humans, 7 which would go to the dwarves. Some of them have been given out at this point, blah blah blah. One of the dwarf rings was given to King Durin the Third, I think, of the dwarves by Celebrimbor as a gift, and there was many lesser rings that there were their first attempts. But Sauron was mainly concerned with the 3 for the elves, 7 for the dwarves, 9 for the humans, and the 3 were also forged without Sauron's help at all, so he really wanted them. Sauron had went away to Mordor and forged the One Ring in secret, and as soon as he put that on, the elves knew what was up. They took off the 3, but they couldn't bring themselves to destroy them. Lol is all I can say to that. All high and mighty, but couldn't bring themselves to destroy them. Dipshits. So they hid all the rings they could. Sauron declares war on them and demands them back. And this is where we're going to pick up today. In the year 1693 of the Second Age, he declared war. This is when Eregion... No, this is when he declared war, and I think he gets to Eregion 2 years later. The war itself would have lasted for around 8 years and finishes in 1701 of the Second Age. And this war was also called the First War with Sauron, because this fucker just doesn't quit. He claimed that the rings were his by right because they couldn't have made them without his teachings. Which, a bit spurious, but hey ho, it is what it is. So, prior to the war, Sauron had gained the allegiance of humans who lived adjacent to Mordor. This included men who lived in the White Mountains and the land that would later become known as Rohan. But at the time, it was still called the Calenarthon. And if you want more information on that, about what the Calenarthon was, go back and listen to just the first episode of the series on Rohan, which I did, where I talk about what this land was before the people of Rohan, but the people who would become the Rohirrim got there. So, over the previous 90 years or so, from about the year 1600 of the Second Age, Sauron had been building and training his armies. You'll remember, in the year 1590 or so, he leaves Eregion. And by the year 1600, I think the One Ring is forged. Go back and listen to the last episode, I've got it right there. But it takes another 90 years or so before he declares open war. And in this time, he's been building and training his armies. Now, Gil-galad was aware of this, because the Númenóreans, who occupied some of the coastal regions nearer to Mordor, it was more of the south of what we know as Gondor, they noticed that large armies were building. Hey, Gil-galad, by the way, we're seeing a lot of people arming for war, and they're all kind of going towards Mordor, where your old pal Sauron/Anatar lived. So they knew something was up. They knew it was Sauron. They knew something bad was coming. But what made this more confusing in terms of like intel gathering is that Sauron, those were just the armies of his that you saw. Sauron never allowed any of the armies he made and trained from the east. He never allowed them to come in contact or be seen by any of the Númenóreans or other kind of like quote-unquote good guys, right? So he kept them out of the way of the region that we know as Gondor. He kept them out of the way of Mirkwood. He kept them all away from that because he didn't want anyone to know that his armies were bigger than they thought. He didn't want to. I think he just didn't want to be seen as much of a threat as he was until he was ready. Quite amusingly, I found out from Unfinished Tales, his efforts to build armies in the east and the south were a lot less successful than they otherwise would have been. Apparently, and stop me if this sounds familiar, two powerful enemies of Sauron, who may have been at work disrupting and sabotaging his efforts to recruit and dominate. And apparently, there was two pesky blue fellas who were stirring up a lot of rebellion and dissension, which stopped a lot of his efforts. And of course, I'm referring to the possibility that the two blue wizards, whose names may have been Morin-Etar and Romestamo, which means Darkness Slayer and East Helper. So later in life, Tolkien came back to these two figures and he rewrote some earlier stuff. He said that now they arrived in Middle-earth around the year 1600 of the Second Age, which is also when Glorfindel was sent back over the sea as well. And this was also possibly given as the date when Barad-dûr was finished, which, kind of makes sense because it was just in time for Sauron to start building and training his armies. So it all fits quite nicely there. But they may have been tasked with also finding out exactly where Sauron had his main hiding place in the east, but they weren't able to do that. So we don't know much about the east, possibly because they weren't able to gather that much intelligence about Sauron in particular. But what apparently the two blue wizards did was allegedly they were quite successful in finding tribes of humans in the east who had rebelled against Melkor in the ancient days and encouraged them to now rebel against Sauron. So this enabled them to sabotage efforts and ultimately ensure that Sauron's forces in the east didn't outnumber the forces in the west. And this would have lasting consequences because it seems like those tribes that rebelled never faced recidivism. They never went back to Sauron. because that carried on into the Third Age. So the two blue wizards contributed not just to victory in the Second Age, but also in the War of the Ring. So the two great fellas, pretty good. And just as a bit of background, in the ancient days, when humans first woke in Middle-earth, most of them were corrupted to worship Melkor, Morgoth, Sauron's boss. Those who didn't want to generally left, and there was 3 big tribes who left the east and travelled west. They got to Beleriand, and they were known as the Houses of the Edain. And they're the ones who, at the end of the First Age, went on to form Númenor. But what this writing suggests is that just because they didn't flee west doesn't mean that there wasn't tribes who stayed in the east, who arguably might have been braver to stay in a place where everybody fucking hates you and wants to kill you, and they rebelled against Morgoth then, stayed in the east for the rest of the years up until the Second Age, where they were able to then rebel against Sauron as well. So pretty hardcore. I'd like to hear more about them. That'd be pretty cool. But that's by the by. For more information on other versions of the Blue Wizards, like some of the other names they have and, various versions, I do have an episode that we did on the Astari, the 5 Wizards, so you can go and listen to that. Tolkien wrote a fair bit on a logical question. If Gil-galad and the Númenóreans had 90 years where they knew Sauron was gathering his forces, why didn't they gather theirs quicker and attack him first before they came to invade Eregion? Why let it carry on when, you were just going to fuck shit up? And the answer came surprisingly from the nature of... Not surprisingly, of course he fucking wrote about it. It came from the nature of Middle-earth, where Tolkien points out 2 things. Firstly, this was the Númenóreans who were reporting this to Gil-galad. So it had to go through the lens of the Númenóreans passing on observations. The first point was the Númenóreans who saw the armies had no real idea of his power or his intentions. For all they know, Sauron could have been facing another enemy of his own in the east, and that's why he was gathering armies. And arguably at this point, the Númenóreans have started to become a bit twattish. So maybe they thought, you know what, pot, kettle black, gathering armies, colonising other places, fucking shit up. Who am I to judge? And we'll see that in a second. And the second point is that in the year 1600, around about then, Sauron was still in the guise of a friend to the elves. Like, you remember, he doesn't stop... He doesn't reveal himself as Sauron until he puts on the One Ring. So right up until that moment, everybody in the world who knows about him thinks that he is Anatar, friend of the elves. So, even if they caught a glimpse of Sauron himself personally gathering the armies... They might still be unsure. Like, why would you declare war on someone? So you remember that Gil-galad rejected him from Lindon, and so did Galadriel and Elrond, but Celebrimbor didn't. So it's politics, right? Even if Gil-galad was 99% sure Sauron was up to no good, that 1% wrong. What if he was Anatar, emissary of the Valar? What if he was there to help them? If he was 1% wrong, Gil-galad might piss off the Valar, which he doesn't want to do, obviously, but you would definitely piss off Celebrimbor and the other Gwaith Myrdain, who were the leaders of Ostin-Ethil in Eregion, right? So the Númenóreans won't have known at the time that Sauron was just about to do what he was going to do with the One Ring. So, there was just too much, there was a bit unsure. And then obviously he does reveal himself with the One Ring, but it still apparently doesn't seem like enough of a reason to attack him. But hey-ho. So it then took Sauron 90 years before he felt ready for open war. He recruited and he trained all sorts of humans that he could get his hands on. But you're probably thinking, what about the orcs? He did have some orcs, but at the end of the First Age, at the War of Wrath, the hosts of the bad, quote-unquote bad guys were absolutely decimated. More than decimated. They were absolutely fucked. Decimated means 1 in 10. It's probably more than that. Their populations were massively reduced. So the orcs had to go into hiding. And they had spent all that time reproducing and multiplying. And when his disguise was stripped away, Sauron then allowed the orcs to come out of hiding. Before then, he could never be seen with them. Ever. Ever, ever, ever. Because that would obviously put waste to any plans he had. But there was also another group of orcs that he then had to recruit, and he couldn't do this until he was himself openly. And these were the orcs from the east. And the orcs from the east apparently were much like crueler and tougher and stronger than the others. These are the orcs that had been under the direct control of Morgoth back in the First Age before he returned to Thangorodrim. And the Thangorodrim, for anyone who wonders, this was where Morgoth lived in the First Age. He had a fortress under it called Angband, under the mountains, and Thangorodrim is just three peaks of, like, volcanoes, three volcanoes, essentially. And he lived under that, and that's where his fortress was. And these orcs had been left to govern themselves. And govern's a weird word, because they had grown now, in all those that 1,500 years since, they had grown wild and ungovernable. And apparently these orcs were so fierce they preyed on one another and humans alike, both good and bad. And these orcs were so fierce that when Sauron appeared to them in the form of Anatar, they laughed at him. They scorned him. They just like, fuck off. They didn't know the power of the elves. They didn't know how powerful the elves were because they lived so far in the east. And they didn't know how brave the humans were, like the Númenóreans, the Edain. It was none of their concern. They weren't subservient to this posh twink who came and tried to give them honeyed words. So I think what happened is that when Sauron's disguise was stripped away, I think he then got him under control pretty quickly. And he probably took on a form that was utterly terrifying to them. You'd imagine so. Like, you know, if that's what it's going to take, that's what it's going to take. And so, after he gets his armies in order, he sets out he declares open war, and he begins to travel towards Eregion to get his rings back. Now, as we move towards Eregion and that, I'm going to give you a little bit of a refresher on geography. It's not massively important, but it's just a bare mention, right? If you look at a map of Middle-earth, there is a massive, massive, massive stretch of land. And in the east, you've got the Misty Mountains, where Moria is, and Rivendell nearby, all that. Then on the left-hand side, the west side, you've got the Blue Mountains. And in front of the Blue Mountains is a river called Lune. Between this river and the Misty Mountains is a huge country called Eriador. The Shires there, all the stuff you mainly see in like the first half of Fellowship, that's all in Eriador. And within Eriador, the main region where the elves lived was called Eregion, where we're going to spend a lot of our time today. And then the Grey Havens, which you see in the films and in the books, the Grey Havens where the ships leave from to take you west, they go from the river Lune. So if you travel west and slightly south along the river, just before you get, as it opens up into the sea, that's called the Gulf of Lune. And just there is where the Grey Havens are. So once you cross over the river, you are then in Lindon. And Lindon is where King Gil-galad ruled. So he was the ruler of the elves in Middle-earth. He was the High King of the Noldor. And his power extended across most of Middle-earth. But he ruled and lived in Lindon. And Celebrimbor lived in Eregion, which was in Eriador on the other side of the Blue Mountains. Cool? Champion. Anyway, right. In the year 1695, Sauron is marching through the land of Calinarthon, through the Gap of Rohan. And this was expected. This was a logical place for any enemy that wanted to attack the elves from the east would have to come through this gap. And this is the gap between the southern end of the Misty Mountains and the northern part of the White Mountains. And this was so well known that this was predicted 800 years before, when King Gil-galad had sent Tar-Meneldur that letter that I talked about in the last episode. Do you know the one I said would make a great stage play? He'd sent that letter to Númenor that warned of a new evil rising in Middle-earth, and he was asking for help. And the letter says, "When assault comes, as it surely will, we should seek to hold the Westlands, where still the Eldar dwell, and men of your race, whose hearts are not yet darkened. At the least, we must defend Eriador about the long rivers west of the mountains we name Hithaiglir, our chief defence. But in that mountain wall there is a great gap southwards in the lands of Calenarthon, and by that way inroad from the east must come. So he knew that they knew this is where we were going to get attacked from. And this is exactly what happened. Sauron's armies were huge and they were on the move. They invaded Eriador from the south, and once they were inside Eriador, they turned north to make it towards Eregion. So, a sensible question that anyone would ask... Fuck, my nose is itchy, sorry. A sensible question that anyone would ask is, did Sauron encounter any resistance? Did the Elves send any resistance? Did the Númenóreans offer any resistance? Apart from the Númenóreans, the short answer is no. The people who lived in these lands that they were walking through, once you get into Eriador, through the gap, they were fucking fed up of the Númenóreans and the Elves. They were sick of their shit, the people who lived in these lands. The Elves, because they were friends with the Númenóreans, but they really had their beef with the Númenóreans. Because the Númenóreans deforested a fuckload of Middle-earth. They really fucked the land up. They changed it forever. The Númenóreans had cut down so many trees that there's a forest just outside the Shire called the Old Forest, and Fangorn Forest on the west side of the Misty Mountains, in the west of Rohan. That is no longer, that used to be connected. It said that a squirrel could go from the Old Forest to Fangorn without touching the ground. The Númenóreans had cut down so many trees, they had got rid of all of that forest. And the people who lived in these lands lived in those forests. They were forest dwellers. The natives of that land lived among the trees. So fuck no. They welcomed Sauron. They cheered him on. Yes, you might have orcs with you, but fuck those guys. I'll help you. And so the people who lived in these lands, they welcomed them. They said, get rid of the colonizers, fuck them. They let them pass unchallenged. They even helped Sauron by becoming spies and leading raiding parties to burn the wood stores of the Númenóreans. And when they could, they ambushed the Númenóreans. And this, I'm going to read a little bit here, and this makes the Númenóreans sound like absolute bastards. The native people of Londare and the lands thereabouts, which was a Númenórean harbour, Londare, were fairly numerous and warlike, but they were forest dwellers, scattered communities without central leadership. They were in awe of the Númenóreans, but they did not become hostile until the tree felling became devastating. Then they attacked and ambushed the Númenóreans when they could, and the Númenóreans treated them as enemies and became ruthless in their fellings, giving no thought to husbandry or replanting. The devastation wrought by the Númenóreans was incalculable. For long years, these lands were their chief source of timber, not only for their shipyards at Londare and elsewhere, but also for Númenor itself. Shiploads innumerable passed west over the sea. The denuding of the lands was increased during the war in Eriador, for the exiled natives welcomed Sauron and hoped for his victory over the men of the sea. Sauron knew of the importance to his enemies of the Great Haven and its shipyards, and he used these haters of Númenor as spies and guides for his raiders. He had not enough force to spare for any assault upon the forts at the Haven or along the banks of the Gwathlo, but his raiders made much havoc on the fringe of the forest, setting fire in the woods and burning many of the great wood stores of the Númenóreans. That makes me hate what they have become. This to me is the decline of Númenor in like free fall now. It's that bit about they became ruthless in their fellings, giving no thought to husbandry or replanting. It's just destroying the land for short-sighted gain, and it rings far too much of real world. That's horrible. Sauron felt comfortable enough here, he felt welcomed enough here, that he left a force at a place called Tharbad as the rest of the army carried on to Eregion. And Tharbad was a few miles away from the river that marked the southern border of Eregion. And that was called Glanduin. And Glanduin is a Sindarin word which means border river. Glan means border, Duin means river. So you got the Baranduin, which is the Brandywine. So Tharbad means road crossing. Thar is over and Pad is walk or step. And it could also translate to like stepping stones as well, right? So anyway, Sauron left soldiers there. I should also note that Gil-galad wasted no time in calling Numenor for help. He'd sent a letter 800 years ago, but he sent another one now. Politely waited for a response before sending a second one. But he sent a message in 1695 asking for help. The king at the time responded. He sent a great navy, but unfortunately it was delayed and it wouldn't arrive for another 5 years in the year 1700. So still, we're in the year 1695. Gil-galad sends out a force under the command of Elrond to reinforce Eregion, right? Go and help Celebrimbor, make sure that Sauron is driven back. In later writings, Tolkien also says that Celeborn, Galadriel's husband, is able to gather a force and join them during this fight, right? So while they were able to repel some of them, like they were able to give a good fight, they got the vanguard, which is, you know, the advanced force of the army. The size of what Sauron was bringing was just too much to match. So for 2 full years, Elrond's forces were held off and beaten back by one part of the army, while the other half invaded Eregion. Imagine like how big we're talking about here, that they're able to hold off one army for 2 years while they do something else to an entire like region. Fucking crazy. So 2 years later, in 1697, Sauron's forces has now laid ruin to Eregion, and they've captured Ostin-Ithil, which is the capital where Celebrimbor and the others forged the rings, and this is where they all lived. The group, you remember, was called the Gwaith Myrdain. Celebrimbor himself led the last desperate defence on the steps of the House of the Myrdain, and this was the most important place to them because this was where their smithies were and all their treasures were kept. But Celebrimbor fought bravely, but he was grappled to the ground and captured alive, which, if you know your Sauron, that is not a good place to be captured, is alive. If you are ever going to be captured by Sauron, take the cyanide, because chances are you're not going to have a good time. I will point you to examples of Gollum, Beren, the one-handed, Finrod Felagund, and of course Gorlim the Sad. None of these people had a good time when captured by Sauron. The House of the Myrdain was ransacked, and the lesser rings were taken. All the ones that aren't counted in the 7, 9, 3, right? The 3 and the 7 were not found, but the 9 were. The 9 were recovered. So, Sauron needed answers. He went to work. Celebrimbor was tortured. And I'll leave that up to your imagination. In the shadow of the war games, you see flashbacks of Celebrimbor being beaten with his own smithing, like his dual hammer. And in Rings of Power, I think Sauron shoots him with a bow, and then like puts him on spears him. Fuck knows. But I personally always like to prefer to think of the Hellraiser Cenobite route of torture, but each to their own. I just think that he'd have a bit more subtlety, being an immortal being, but whatever. From all this punishment, Sauron learns where the 7 are. Cool, but he's not really that bothered about them. Some of them had already been given out, and it said, I don't know why Tolkien did this, it makes him sound like a dick. It said that Celebrimbor didn't care as much about giving up the information on these because they weren't made for the elves. What a fucking prick move. Like, I don't know whether I'm more annoyed at Tolkien saying that he said that, or the character himself. I don't know. Fuck them both, just to be sure. But Sauron couldn't get the information about the 3. Celebrimbor would not give that up. He went as far as he went and would give no more information. So Sauron never for sure learned who had the 3 rings, and so he puts Celebrimbor to death. However, he did guess that the rings must have passed to important elves, so he made an educated guess that at least Galadriel and Gil-galad had 2 of them. Which was, that was his main guess. And this is possibly one of the most metal deaths in the Legendarium, because he is shot through, Celebrimbor is shot through with orc arrows, then his body is hung on a pole, still full of arrows, and they use him as a banner when they turn their attention to Elrond's forces. That is, that's the ultimate, demoralization of, oh shit, I recognize that banner. I had tea with him last week. And Elrond's forces were desperate now. Some elves had escaped Eregion and joined him, but even with like the whoever escaped, there still wasn't enough. It wasn't a big enough force. And now that they'd captured Ost-in-Ethil, they could turn their full attention to him. So they needed to escape, all of them. They would have been overwhelmed and destroyed, but for the dwarves saving the day, right? Moria from Khazad-dûm came forth a great host of dwarves and some elves from Lothlorien. And leading the elves from Lothlorien was Prince Amroth. He's a famous elf who would later become king of Lothlorien after his dad, and he was known widely for his love of an elf called Nimrodel, and they've got a lovely song, and it's very, very nice. Anyway, back to the death and the bloodshed. So the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, Prince Amroth and his force of elves attack Sauron's forces from the rear. This allows Elrond to escape northwards and establish a refuge, where they would later go under siege. So Amroth and the dwarves were then forced back when the army turned on them fully, but they retreated through the gates of Moria and they were shut. Now these are the gates of Moria that we see. And Sauron could not pass these gates once they were shut. And he becomes so angry that forever after it said Moria had his hatred, and the orcs were then ordered to kill or mess with dwarves however they could afterwards. They were told to harry them wherever they could. It's pretty intense hatred, right? And it also adds fuel to the fire for the war between dwarves and orcs in the Third Age. So we've got that another instance of shit getting wild. Sauron was furious, naturally, at lots of things here. Another thing was how dare the elves of Lothlorien interfere. And Lothlorien would eventually, well, he planned that Lothlorien would be one of his targets. But he first needed do one country at a time, right? Eriador first, then he'd move on. So he started moving towards Lindon. And this is where King Gil-galad. I keep saying Ging. But as you might recall, right, when he was Anatar, Gil-galad, Galadriel, and Elrond wanted naught to do with Sauron. So he tended to stay away from Lindon, the capital of, Gil-galad's kingdom. So he gravitated towards Eregion and Ost-in-Ethil with the Jewelsmiths. But now he was going back to Lindon for war. And he thought that if he took Lindon, there'd be a good chance that he'd be able to grab one or more of the Elvish rings of power. That's a fairly educated guess, right? You kill Gil-galad, he's probably got a ring. If Galadriel's there as well, she's probably got a ring. He doesn't know who the third one is, but if you kill enough people, you probably turn up. So, the war continues. By the year 1699, Sauron has ran rampant over the whole of Eriador. Gil-galad is barely holding on. But Sauron has messed up a little bit, because Elrond has escaped and now has a sizable force of elves that are in a refuge that has become a stronghold that, because of where it is easily defensible from a siege. And also, while this was going on, the Númenóreans, who previously always visited Lindon, began to stockpile resources in preparation for war. That started as soon as Gil-galad sent the message to Númenor. So for years, the Númenóreans have been coming up the river, stockpiling provisions and, doing that resource run. So now Sauron essentially is fighting a war on two fronts, which for any one of us who knows our World War history, fighting a war on two fronts is never a good idea. Ask Hitler. So we mentioned that Elrond had disappeared and escaped. Well, he wasn't sitting around with his thumb up his arse like you'd think. He didn't just go into hiding. Like I said, he was under siege, and it kept enough of the forces distracted that it wasn't an overwhelming, crushing victory straight away for Sauron. But he and the elves who escaped formed a stronghold, and they were joined by other elves gradually who could escape and get there. And that was the founding of Imladris and what we may know as Rivendell, which was founded in the year 1697 of the Second Age. So by the time of Lord of the Rings, it's about 4,500 years old. I think I'd have to do some maths. It's probably more than that. Maybe closer to, 3,000 in the Third Age. maybe like 5,000, 6,000 years old. It's really old. It's really old. I'm sorry, my maths is terrible. I'm reading my notes. Let's not make fun of the 31-year-old man who can't do maths while he's thinking about history. Anyway, this would become important naturally for all kinds of reasons. I don't have to tell you how important Rivendell was. So in the year 1700 of the Second Age, Imladris is under siege. Elrond can't come to help Gil-galad. Gil-galad is barely holding the lines, and he is doing everything he can to stop Sauron from taking over Lindon and recovering at least one of the Elvish Rings of Power. They are fighting at the River Lune, which is a gateway to the realm of Lindon. If Sauron crosses the river and takes the Grey Havens, it is pretty much game over. There's supplies there. It's a defensible strategic point. You'd hem them in. You'd really it'd be like if anybody ever plays chess and the king retreat, like you get to the end game and the king retreats to the back corner of a board and you've got pieces moving in. That's essentially what it's starting to look like. The king is being backed into the corner step by step. If he crosses the river, it's game over. So Sauron needs this last push. So he sends summons for his army, more of his forces from the southeast to come and reinforce him so they can take the Grey Havens. All is lost. And this is the point of the tale where Tolkien's eucatastrophe comes in. All is lost. The day is bleak. And just as things go slow motion and Gil-galad's looking around, you see over the horizon the masts of the ships of Númenor. The great navy has arrived from Westerness. There is an admiral called Ciriatur who is leading them, and he drives back Sauron's forces at the River Lune. He greatly reinforces Gil-galad's armies, but he's smart as well. He orders some of his ships to go further south. He says, don't fight now, go south. I want you to dock at one of our harbours. And so they do. But the forces that are left, it's enough. Sauron is defeated, and he has to retreat quickly as he can to the southeast. The next stage of the battle, where he's now got armies pursuing him. He's got Númenorians and Elves together pursuing him. They catch up with them at the Sarn Ford, where he's defeated, and this pushes him out of Eriador. And he's only got a small fraction of his forces left, and he decides to burn the forests just to be a twat. He burns two forests, Minaraeth and Enedwaith. They both get burned as he retreats from Eriador. And a side note, I've mentioned Sarn Ford, and I might be tickling the little taint of your brain. Sarn Ford is the southern borders of what would become the Shire. So in the Third Age, it was guarded by the Rangers of the North, but they were driven off during the events of Lord of the Rings when the ring wraiths arrive and enter the Shire. So Sarn Ford is where the ring wraith Camul enters the Shire during the War of the Ring. And Camul, for anyone wondering, basically whenever during like the first part of Fellowship, whenever you see a Black Rider, when he's like talking to Farmer Maggot, talking to Sam's dad, Hamfast Gamgee, whenever he's trying to catch them at the ferry, whenever he stops on the road and they run off, blah, 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 that's Camul. He's not joined by the other ring wraiths until a little bit later. He's the main guy in that part of the book. And interestingly enough, Sarn Ford was named by the Númenorians after another place called Sarn Athrad in Beleriand. And Sarn Athrad translates to Stony Ford. So Sarn Ford and Sarn Athrad both mean Stony Ford. But Sarn Athrad, the one in Beleriand, is the name of the place where there's a story from the First Age where the dwarves and the elves kill each other in a huge debacle. There is a necklace called the Nauglamir, and a big kerfuffle starts between a certain group of dwarves and some elves, right? The dwarves are hired by King Thingol, Elf King, to make him a beautiful necklace and set a Silmaril into it. Silmaril, the most beautiful gems ever made. Set one of the Silmarils into the necklace. They do it, but when they do, they think, ooh, this is probably better to be a dwarven treasure. And Kingol, fucking hell, Christopher. Thingol. Do you know what? Fuck it. My new name for him now, Kingol. Right, Thingol gets fresh with him. He says, do you know what? Fuck you, stupid dwarves, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, they kill him. And two of the dwarves make it out alive. They go back to Nogrod which is their city, and they tell lies. Oh my god, you wouldn't believe it. The king of the elves fucking killed us for no reason, blah blah blah. And so an army of dwarves invade Doriath, and it causes a lot of shit. And there is a battle where treasure is spilled into the water, and that battle takes place at San Athrad. And I just want to, for any of my dwarf brothers out there, the dwarves of Belagos wanted no part in that nonsense. It was literally just the dwarves of Nogrod. But that's a story for another day, right? That's first age stuff. Let's get back to the second age. After the Battle of San Ford, Sauron has only a fraction of his army left. But, if you remember from earlier in the story, he left some orcs at Tharbad. However, what is nearby to Tharbad is a place called Londare, which I've mentioned, and Londare is a Númenórean harbour, and the great Admiral Kiriator sent some of his ships southwards to land at Londare. So even though Sauron is reinforced by orcs, he is now fucked. This is what we call an Eiffel Tower, because Sauron is attacked from behind and from the front, and what becomes known as the Battle of Gwathlo. And Gwathlo is the name for the River Greyflood, which is where this takes place. He gets shafted. It's defeat after defeat, right? The Númenóreans come at him from the rear in the south, and Gil-galad's elves come at him from the north, and they fuck him up, and he can only flee. His force is now nearing nothing. His army's routed, so he flees across the River Isen back into the Calenarthon. But it's not enough. He's pursued again, and he gets caught in the eastern end of the Calenarthon. Right? He makes it almost all the way across, and he gets caught again. This time, when they're finished with him, only him and a small group of bodyguards are able to escape. Sauron manages to get back to Mordor, but he is utterly humiliated and broken. He swears vengeance on Númenor and turns all of his efforts to that as he rebuilds his power. And for the army that was left in Eriador that was besieging Imladris, they now get caught between the hammer and the anvil. Elrond comes out of Rivendell with his elves, and Gil-galad comes from the rear with his army. So after 8 years, uncounted deaths and total destruction, Eriador is finally clear of enemies. But it's almost now completely in ruins. It's decimated. That's the end of the war. And this is when the first White Council is held, which you might hear referred to as like the Council of the Wise. And it's basically a gathering of the head honchos in Middle-earth. At this first one, nobody really knows who attended, but we could probably guess that Elrond, Gil-galad, Celeborn and Galadriel would maybe be there, because they all should have been present in Imladris at that time. I don't know if they'd have extended an invitation to Kiriator, but I don't know. Doesn't seem like an elf thing to do. I don't know. And what happens here is a very important decision is made. They decide that Imladris should now be the stronghold of elves in Eriador, rather than Eregion. And to go along with this, Elrond is named Vice-Regent of Gil-galad, and he's given the ring, Vilya, as a bearer of the Ring of Power. And he uses this to preserve Imladris and have it prosper for the next few thousand years, until we see it in The Hobbit and then in Lord of the Rings as the peaceful paradise it is, and until the Fourth Age when they all leave in earnest. And that is how the war between the elves and Sauron ended. All was lost. He pushed right up to the gates almost of the king of the elves before being turned back by a rising power in Middle-earth. A very quickly rising power. A very powerful rising power. It was harsh, it was bloody, and it was epic. And it's the first big battle, proper big battle of the Second Age, but we've got more to come. But, like most tales, there's an after-credits scene, and it probably takes place in Barad-dûr, right? Sauron broods over his defeat at the hands of the Númenóreans. And see, his power now would never really reach the height again that it had during the war between him and the elves. However, his enemies have also been weakened. Maybe not the Númenóreans so much, but the elves definitely were devastated by this. The dwarves wouldn't open the way to Moria again from they wouldn't open the western gates until the Third Age, when we see the Fellowship pass through. So it's he's diminished, but so are his enemies. He knows now that he probably won't take Númenor in a straight fight, and he has to be clever, right? He has rings. He has powerful rings now. He has the 9, and he has the 1, and he knows how to use them. And so Sauron comes up with a plan, and that plan is where we're going to pick up next episode, when we discuss the events that lead up to Sauron in Númenor and the downfall of Númenor, when God himself steps in to fix things, essentially. And that is the end of the episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been significantly heavier, I think, than most episodes, because there was just so much to get through that I didn't want to distract by making flippant comments. It is what it is. If you enjoyed this episode, I'm glad you did. I hope you learned something. If you didn't, you've made it right to the end anyway. So, a listen's a listen. So it sucks to be you, I'm afraid. I hope you've learned a lot. I hope, I was blown away, as usual, researching this, thinking, it won't be that too bad, and then boom, fucking 8 pages of notes later, and almost 50-minute recording session, which is quite a lot when it's just me talking. It's usually, obviously, it's a lot easier when there's me and Rebecca together. But yes, I hope you're having a fantastic day wherever you are. As I mentioned, I'm going to see the Sauron episode series through to the end, and then we're going to do some lighter episodes for a bit. But I feel like we've still got a fair ways to go on this one. So I'm going to leave it there. Have a wonderful day wherever you are. I hope that you continue to make good decisions, drink plenty of water, and don't spend too much time on the internet. This podcast aside, obviously, because I've noticed that people start to talk about things in real life that are important on the internet that nobody really cares about offline, and it's a bit weird. So if you find yourself angry over things that you only ever really talk about online, it might be a good idea to give yourself a break from the internet for a bit. That's just some little nuggets of wisdom I've told a friend or two recently. But yes, right, nobody comes to this podcast for fucking life advice. That's not what we're here for. Good shit. Right, I will catch you on the next one. Bye.